In this chapter, we're going to look at the psychosocial development that occurs within the first 2 years of human development. So one of the first things, in dealing with the sociology of development, we're going to look at emotions, the emotions that occur in interacting with one's environment. So early emotions, usually those are, kind of high emotional responsiveness. So there's like a high emotional response to scenarios and things that occur in life. And also, children at that age, they're very reactive. They have very reactive pain and pleasure to complex social awareness, So then a couple things I just put in here that I wanted to make you aware of. I don't think you have to memorize this, but this just to make you aware that smiling and laughing. Usually babies, will start to have, having social smiles, viewing when they view other humans and stuff, usually around, 6 weeks old, when they'll begin to laugh, when they're curious about things, they'll start to laugh out loud, somewhere between 3 to 4 months. Other emotions that will develop during this time are anger. And usually that's first expressed, around 6 months, and that's considered a healthy response to frustration. And then the other emotion is sadness, and that can usually appear in the first months of development. And so that can indicate, withdrawal and is accompanied by increased production of cortisol in the brain, which is a stress hormone. So I want to keep an eye out for that if one is a parent or in a situation where one is caring for children. Other emotions to talk about are fear. That usually emerges around 9 months old in response to people, things, situations. And so there's a couple different types of fear here that I'm going to talk about, like stranger wariness, So that's when infants start to, they quit smiling at just any face they see, but starts to look frightened or cries, when an unfamiliar person gets a little too close. That's called stranger wariness. Whereas, another type of emotion will be what's called separation anxiety. And that's usually like tears, dismay, anger when a familiar caregiver leaves, where the child can no longer see it, that person. So usually remains strong until after age 3. And if it does remain in effect after age 3 and further on, that could be considered an emotional disorder if that continues to develop or demonstrate. Okay, so now we're going to talk about social awareness. So usually, within the first 4 months, infants, they have no sense of self, and they'll just mainly see themselves as part of their mothers. Whereas between 15 to 24 months, they'll start to develop a sense of quote unquote me, themselves. So that is what we refer to as self-awareness. And I did put a definition here for you. So self-awareness, that refers to a person's realization that he or she is a distinct individual whose body, mind, and actions are separate from those of other people. So that is something important to know from this slide here. Okay, now we'll start taking a look at temperament. And what is temperament? That's just, basically is considered inborn differences between one person and another in their emotions, their activity, their self-regulation. So one thing that is important to keep in mind is, temperament, is epigenetic, means originates in the genes, but is affected by child rearing practices. So child rearing practices can actually cause certain genes to express. Okay, now we'll take a look here at the brain and emotional expression. What is how are they related? And so experience and culture, is really important. And it's actually experience and culture that connects, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and helps connect feelings with those of others, so different things, like social smile, laughter, fear, self-awareness, anger, all those, they actually sculpt the actual physical structure of the brain. And that's just something important to keep in mind as we proceed. And we're going to talk about development of social bonds, and there's what's called attachment. And attachment, that's in a long-lasting emotional bond that one person has with another. And so it begins to form in early infancy and influences a person's, close relationships throughout his or her life. So signs of attachment. Well, first of all, infants show their attachment in several ways, so they're proximity seeking. So what that means is approaching and following their caregivers. They want to be in close proximity, close by. And then there's what's called contact maintaining. That's stuff like, touching, snuggling, and holding. So all those are different ways that infants demonstrate their attachment. So I just, for those of you who would like a more in-depth definition of attachment, I did put, attachment, it's considered a universal part of inborn social nature of the human species. So humans are naturally, social creatures. So they consider that an inborn universal type thing that occurs within humans, all humans. Now, specific manifestations of attachment, can vary, according to culture and age of the people who are attached to each other. So just keep that in mind. Now, there's a couple different types of attachment right here that I'd like to make you aware of, and this is important to remember and to learn and understand. Number one is secure attachment. So that's the type of relationship in which an infant is both comfortable and confident from the presence of his or her caregiver. So that is important. Whereas an insecure / avoidant attachment, that is a kind of attachment in which an infant avoids connection with the caregiver. For example, when the infant seems to not care about the caregiver's presence, departure, or return. So that's something to be very aware of and to have a clear understanding about. Now, I just put this chart in here just for you to look at on your own. Feel free to pause the video and study this, for further insight. This just, talks about various types of attachment and, how they occur and that kind of thing and what age, that kind of thing. Okay, so furthering on our discussion about development of social bonds, we're going to talk about insecure attachment and social setting. So findings, what they found, what researchers have found about that, is things like harsh contexts, especially the stresses of poverty, they can actually reduce the incidence of secure attachment. Now, that's an interesting thing. So you may want to pause and think about why that might occur. Why would things like poverty actually influence social attachment, especially secure attachment? Okay, so we're going to continue on, so we've got a couple cautions here, so insecure attachment, it can be a sign, not always, but it may be, a sign that, that is not really the direct cause of certain problems, so the attachment itself might just be a manifestation, but not the actual cause of the certain problems. Okay, so we're going to move on here. So development of social bonds, we're going to talk about social referencing. So social referencing, all that refers to is basically seeking emotional responses or information from other people. So basically looking at other people and then getting one's information, how to react emotionally in a certain scenario or situation. Now, I did include this photo here because, not many of us would, consider even eating something like this right here. This type of um, worm or whatever that is. It just doesn't look that appetizing to those of us who are culture. That's not a cultural norm. But for this person right here, that might be considered a social norm and learn that behavior and emotion through social referencing. Okay, now if a child is experiencing depression, or insecure attachment and that kind of thing, like who to blame on that, and I put this in here just to, to kind of spur your thought, to have you think about this. So really the first and foremost thing, that we should be aware of is we shouldn't blame the child, because their children are naturally kind of curious and careless, but maybe the fathers are not, you know what I mean? And so some other things to think about, so things like depression and spanking, like in parenting styles, those are affected by things like financial stress, socioeconomic status. Also, if things like marital conflict, cultural norms, and so, what do you think about that? Moving on. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of the theories of psychosocial development for infants. Number one, this researcher named Erickson, his name is actually Erik Erikson. That is a name that you will hear and is very prevalent in developmental psychology. But it says that, basically that as individuals grow and develop, they go through various stages that he called trust and autonomy stages. So basically, in the early years, babies will learn to trust versus mistrust, things like that. And autonomy means, a confidence in their own abilities and coping mechanisms and things. And if not, they may experience, like things like shame, doubt. So those are what the important takeaways are from this slide. Now, some more theories here, is what's called behaviorism. So this researcher named Watson, I'm not going to really, like quiz you and test you on memorizing researchers' names so much as I'm really concerned about the concept. And first and foremost, behaviorism, that's the emotions and personality are molded through parental reinforcement of punishment. That's what this researcher posited. And social learning theorists, they said that, infant behavior also reflects social referencing. So they may learn their behavior and through reinforcement and punishment, but they can also learn their behavior through social referencing. And there's a couple different types of parenting one should be aware of in discussing this. And one is called proximal parenting. And basically that just means parenting where the parents are physically close to the baby with frequent holding and touching. So within close proximity, hence the term proximal. Now, different than that is what's called distal parenting. And so that is basically where the parent or the caregiver remains kind of distant from the baby, but might provide toys, food, face-to-face communication, but minimal holding and touching. So those are two types of parenting styles that one should be aware of: distal and proximal. So here are just some research findings here. Feel free to pause this video and look at these a little more in depth. Now, cognitive theory that develops with that, that is concerned with in development with basically that the individual, it's the kind of assumptions they use to organize their perception and experiences. So what is going on in their mental processes? What are they assuming? And how are they organizing those assumptions, and perceptions in order, in relation to their experiences. So that's what's called cognitive theory. That's concerned with the mental processes that the young person will be going through in their development. And so I'm not going to read all of these here. Please feel free to pause the video and look at these for your own further insight. Now, evolutionary theory, on the other hand, that's just more like, concerned with the emotions that we experience because of our survival mechanism, our need to survive. So that's all we really need to know from this slide right here. So I'm moving on. And so that concludes our discussion. Please get your study guides and begin to answer this chapter study guide, answer its questions, and also refer to your textbooks if you need help with that. So we'll see you on the next chapter.